Hello, I'm Matthew Marnick and welcome to my workshop, Bringing the Wild to Your Backyard, the point of which is learning about how to encourage wildlife to come hang out in a safe place for both animals and people. Now I want to explore the different learning outcomes I hope to achieve through this workshop, which is to say gaining an understanding of basic needs of wildlife, learn what kind of features attract wildlife, and gaining a better understanding of how relationships between native species work. So here are the basic needs of wildlife, which also includes some of our basic needs as well. Water, food, shelter. This is how I'm going to also break down this workshop and hopefully make it more manageable. There is one extra detail I want to add before going any further with this workshop, and is that I built it with Southern and Central Ontario in mind. So when I refer to native species, I'm generally referring to species native to Southern and Central Ontario. Moving on, let's talk about water features and why they matter. Water is essential in many basic functions of all living organisms, and having immediate access to water can be a great blessing for everyone. Now, not all of us have a natural source of water on our property, so I'm going to focus on some things that you can add or install to your backyard to just give access to water to wildlife. So starting with bird baths, which are probably the simplest and easiest addition you can make, there's a pretty big range in not only the size of a bird bath you can get, but also what it's made from. So you could get things made out of cement, natural stone, marble, plastic, metal. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of variation, just a matter of how much you're willing to spend on a bird bath. But generally they're pretty easy to maintain, as you really only need to change the water every few days. And if it's looking pretty scummy, you need to just give it a good scrub down and get rid of all that gunk. And despite the name, more than just birds are going to be using this bird bath. Especially if you have a lot of squirrels in your area, they're probably going to climb up onto it and drink from it. So overall, they're a nice little water feature. Next, I want to talk about artificial ponds. And while they might look pretty, they actually take a lot of work to create an appealing atmosphere. It's best to add some kind of fountain or similar addition to allow for water flow, as the sound of moving water will let animals know where that water can be found in that area, and they'll bring them into your yard. Installing a pond isn't cheap. They usually require regular upkeep. However, they can be a mini ecosystem unto themselves. And depending on the size and your location, you may even be able to stock this pond with carp or a similar fish species. Just to understand that they're quite literally like shooting fish in a barrel. For wildlife that consume fish, you may lose them all to a passing raccoon or heron. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about different food sources. Primarily the idea with this section is that you actually put in the effort to grow a garden that will attract wildlife. This doesn't have to be anything too intense or fancy, but if you have a single shrub all by its lonesome, you just won't cut it. First, let's look at berry-producing trees and shrubs. Due to most of these being medium to large-sized shrubs, many of these are space efficient and grow within smaller backyards. Kind of goes without saying, but having a wider variety of berry-producing plants will attract a larger variety of wildlife, as everyone has their own varying tastes. In addition to this, berries are produced at different times depending on the species, which can range in the early summer to late fall, with some species holding on to their berries over winter. A bonus from some of these berry-producing species is they are also safe for humans to eat. Included on this slide is a short list of some of our native species, which by no means is a complete list of all the berry-producing plants you can find in Ontario, but it covers some trees, some large shrubs, and some small shrubs. And just as another added bonus, all of them are very nice to look at, so they just have some good aesthetic value as well. Second, let's talk about nut and seed-bearing trees and shrubs. Many of these are much more shade-tolerant than the berry-producing plants I previously discussed. They are also a great source of food, especially during mast years when an excess of seed is produced. Similar to the berry-producing species, many of our native nut species are edible, some of which are more surprising than others, such as the acorns from white oak and both the seeds and flowers from eastern redbud. Like the previous slide, I've also included a short list of various native nut and seed-bearing trees and shrubs to Ontario. The majority of these examples are trees. There are some larger shrubs mixed in. Third, I want to talk about some other things to consider. So berries, seeds, and nuts aren't the only food sources for wildlife. Flowering species and this can also include herbaceous plants, produce nectar, which will attract both hummingbirds and insects, such as bees and butterflies. As a general rule, plants will attract insects of all kinds, which will then try and feed on the plants. But don't see this as a negative, because there are some purely bug-eating birds which will take advantage of this bug buffet that you are offering. And as another reminder, the wildlife you'll find in your backyard has evolved to eat the native plants which grow in the area they come from. So planting native species is always a benefit to our native wildlife. And lastly, if all seems to fail, you can also set up feeding stations, such as various bird feeders filled with nuts, seeds, jam, or some kind of nectar substitute for hummingbirds. Just realize that if a bird feeder claims to be squirrel-proof, it more than likely isn't. Now moving on to the last basic need for wildlife, that being shelter. This section serves more as a complementary piece to the previous section, as it generally focuses more on the arrangement of trees and shrubs within a garden. One idea you should aim to achieve for your garden is this concept of layering, where you plant shrubs and trees of different heights and sizes to create a sense of different levels within the canopy of your garden. The reason for this being that wildlife prefers to take shelter in different parts of a canopy, which is especially true in birds, which some will stay high up in a tree, while others might be around that mid-range, and some kind of just scavenge around underneath it. Some wildlife stays relatively close to the ground, such as most small mammals and amphibians, while others, such as squirrels and birds, prefer to take shelter up in the varying heights of trees. Next, I want to discuss hedgerows, which are something like a natural fence, usually made up of the same species grown fairly packed together for an undefined length. Since a hedgerow can be grown across the length of a backyard, it can make for easy access to shelter for both small animals and birds. Some birds may also nest within the hedgerow if they feel it's a safe enough space. Hedgerows can also be supplemented with vines for more food and shelter. However, they may require careful management, or those vines could grow out of control. And like some previous slides, I've also included a short list of some suitable species to grow into hedgerows. Some of them are more shade tolerant than the others, but generally they work fairly well as a hedgerow. And although this is a little off topic, but it's still relevant to shelters, here are simple birdhouses. They can be pretty easy to make on your own, although it can be a little tricky to get birds to move into a birdhouse, as they have most birds have very specific nesting requirements, and they may avoid using birdhouses altogether. And one last thing you should take note of, birdhouses are mostly used during nesting periods, so you can't expect someone to take up residence if you just hang one up late in the season, though they may still use them as just shelter. And now just to summarize things, what does wildlife need? And simply put, water, food, and shelter. What should you be planting in your backyard? For the best odds of success, native plants, specifically those that produce some kind of fruit in the form of berries, or some kind of large seed that animals prefer to eat.